Welcome to our webinar, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and dialing in today. My name is Andreas Pfleger. I am the commercial counselor here in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome and thank you again for joining our webinar Update Kenya today. Before we get started, a little bit of webinar housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared with you afterwards. Also, the presentation slides you can see on your screen will be made available to you after the webinar as well. A big thank you to our guest speakers for agreeing to this. And finally, and most importantly, please, if you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to submit them through the chat function at any point in time. We have a dedicated time slot at the end of the webinar to address any questions that might come up. Let me give you a little bit of a preview of what will happen during the next hour or so. First off, I will be giving you a little bit of a welcome and a short introduction. And after that, we will have our first guest speaker, Mr. Gregor Panicke, who's founder and managing director of Agema Analysts. And he will give us a comprehensive business and legal framework update, the most important things you should be aware of when you do business in Kenya. Next, we'll have Peter Nguni share some consumer sentiment with us, some consumer sentiment insights. Peter is the founder and managing director of Frontier Insights, which is a Kenyan entity that looks at what Kenyan consumers think, feel, and how they decide. And finally, we'll have Edwin Kleiber, the CEO of Amex Healthcare, speak to us about his path and Amex's path to success in Kenya, which I think will be very, very exciting with lots of valuable lessons for all of us. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by giving you a little bit of an overview and a bit of an update on all things Kenya and Austria. Let's take a look at Kenya first. These are just some basic numbers. Again, you will be supplied with the presentation slides after this webinar. 56.4 million is the population of Kenya with a median age below 20 years. These are the most up-to-date numbers that we had access to. This shows already one of the biggest assets that Kenya has, a young, dynamic workforce that wants to build for their own future. The unemployment rate, as you can see, 24, 25, and the 2026 forecast is around 5 to 6%, which is of course a big topic, and most likely unemployment is actually a little bit higher than that. Job creation is a big challenge for any government in the world, and it's the same here in Kenya. Agriculture is one of the most important sectors the Kenyan economy has. 10 to 20, apologies for the typo, 10 to 20% of GDP contribution come from agriculture in Kenya, and 60 to 70% of employment opportunities also come from the agricultural sector. A lot of this takes place in the rural areas of Kenya, and makes a massive contribution to the GDP of Kenya. If we look at the GDP per capita for Kenya, we're at around $6,780 at the moment, which is an increase of 6% in 2024. So as that number keeps growing, prosperity in Kenya will of course also keep growing. If we look at GDP growth, one of the key indicators for any economy, Kenya is moving in the right direction, at least if we follow these predictions and numbers. Kenya is definitely a growing economy, as you'll understand better as we go through this webinar. Inflation is stable between 4 and 5%, with the prediction of 2026 lying at 5.1%. And as a contrasting point to the strong agricultural sector, I also wanted to mention the ICT and digital economy here in Kenya. 10% of GDP contribution already for a rather new sector. The Silicon Savannah, which I'm sure many of you have heard from, is not only a calling card for Kenya, but is actually a global force as well. We have multinational enterprises such as Microsoft that have invested serious money in being here as well, observing what's happening in the Silicon Savannah and taking advantage of it. On the next slide, we'll take a little bit of a look at the trade between Austria and Kenya. First, we're looking at exports from Austria to Kenya. In the period 2023 to 2024, this amounted to a total of 28.4 million in exports, a strong increase of 18.9%. Below, you can see the top 3 categories of Austrian exports into Kenya, with machines, apparatus, and mechanical devices, which is traditionally a strong sector of Austrian exports, taking the first spot with 7.2 million, and the 26 6% decline, still in number one position though. Next, we have optical measuring and testing equipment, 5.8 million of exports from Austria to Kenya, massive increase, more than 250% increase. This has to do, I think, with some specialist medical equipment that was imported into Kenya. And finally, in an always strong position, we have drinks and vinegar and alcoholic liquids from Austria. Most of the drinks from Austria into Kenya are actually non-alcoholic, 3.1 million plus 8.2%. If we look the other way, from Kenya to Austria in the same period, we had 16.8 million euros in exports from Kenya to Austria. And the positions you can see below, the number one spot, we have living trees, plants, and cut flowers with more than 8 million euros. Kenya is a big exporter of fresh flowers, fresh cut flowers, some of them directly into Austria and many into other nations around the globe. In second position, we have more agricultural goods, which again aligns with what I said earlier about agriculture being such a key sector for Kenya. Vegetables and edible plants, 2 million euros in exports to Austria, plus 8%. And in the third position, another agricultural position, edible fruits, citrus peels and melons, 2 million euros, plus 23%. Now, if we take a little bit of a future perspective, what's the outlook for Kenya in 2026? GDP growth is, as I mentioned already, expected to be around 5-6% in 2026. Agriculture remains a strong driver. Agricultural recovery, which of course depends on weather patterns and world market patterns, is a strong factor here. But Kenya also has resilient services such as ICT, finance, and tourism, especially tourism being a strong magnet as well, and strong infrastructure investments, many of them through the government, which solidify this GDP outlook. In the medium term, also the rising middle class purchasing power is set to increase in 2026. Urbanization, people moving from the country into cities, is a trend that continues here in Kenya and Eastern Africa. Digital adoption is high already, but continues to grow. Renewable energy, Kenya already being a very renewable energy driven country with more than 80% of the power in the electric grid coming from renewable sources. All of these factors should again come together to solidify the GDP growth and actually help the Kenyan economy grow. As a final point, the favorable EU-Kenya Economic Partnership Agreement should be mentioned. This has now been in place for a solid year, provides preferential access in the beginning for Kenyan goods into Europe, but slowly over a period of time also for European goods into Kenya, making trade easier. The opportunities that my team and I perceive here in Kenya are in the renewable energy sector, healthcare, agriculture, water management, of course, again connected to agriculture, as well as in the financial services industry. We are always here for you. We always are happy if we receive an email or a call from an Austrian company telling us, we want to get started in Africa. Let's have a first conversation. That's exactly what we're here for. And three of the first things we'll probably share with you is that entering a market in Eastern Africa is definitely a marathon and not a sprint. You need to invest considerable time into building relationships, finding a network, and finding the right way to access your target audience in Kenya. It's also important to have realistic expectations. Kenya is still an emerging economy, but there are many opportunities that can be gained here. And finally, adaptation is basically always a requirement for Eastern Africa and for many target markets in Africa. Cookie cutter solutions that work well in our typical Austrian export markets, being Europe, might not necessarily work in Kenya. So adaptation is definitely a requirement. That's it for the introduction and short overview from my end. And now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first guest speaker. Mr. Gregor Panicke was one of the first people I met when I arrived here in Nairobi more than a year ago. We have a common past in the Middle East. Gregor, I think you're actually joining us from the Middle East today. Gregor is founder and managing director of Agema Analysts, and he will give us a business and legal update. Gregor, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. The stage is yours.
Thank you much, Andreas. Much appreciated. Introduction and good morning and pleasure being here. And thank you much for everyone for joining. Yeah, I think the advisory from Andreas on the entry in the Kenyan market was spot on. And I will come to that point later. That's actually a marathon and not a sprint, and also having realistic expectations. But I will come to that point at a later stage of the presentation. I go to the first slide. Yeah, so As Andreas already mentioned previously, Kenya has, despite some social unrest and political volatilities, a robust growth. Last year, 4.7, and the first quarter of 2025, 4.9, which has been slightly reduced to 4.7. However, it's still a very robust growth path here in Sub-Saharan Africa on average, and even compared to other frontier markets. From a political landscape point of view, the government struggles with tax revenues, and there's a high focus actually on reducing debt, where since the new government is in place, it's a high pressure and on that subject, and where also some social unrest actually evolved based on that, and also legal reforms on the tax measures. Public sentiments and protests, you might seen it in the media in 2024 as well in 2025. There was social unrest, some tensions, rising cost of living, and as well in particular the tax burdens on SMEs and small enterprises, which is a big backbone of the Kenyan economy, startups and so on, felt very much hit by the tax burdens, and the so-called Gen Z movement and demonstration started here, and demonstrations happened. Kenya is still pushing for regional integration, very much on cross-border trade facilitation and digital infrastructure, and still one of the key drivers in the AAC region. Legal and regulatory developments, as I mentioned, the Finance Bill 2024-2025 had some changes, had some adjustments, especially the digital tax 1.5 for cross revenues, and trying to increase the tax base by addressing this tax to multinational companies operating or having actually a nexus to Kenya. VAT restructuring as well, expanded tax bands from an income tax perspective. Very important regulatory requirement, the data protection enforcement. The Data Protection Office in Kenya is really committed to enforce data protection in Kenya. That's a key part which probably new entrants and also incumbent companies should not overlook, to be fully data protection compliant, of course, among many other compliance requirements in Kenya. We have seen several cases in Kenya where the Data Protection Office was taking legal actions, regulatory actions, fines, and even legal proceedings for companies who did not comply with the same. Investment promotion is as Kenya as a key investment hub in Eastern Africa, take it very seriously. There have been new reforms to streamline and increase the protection of FDI, foreign direct investment, in terms of assets and as well as IP. So there's a lot of reforms have been happening, and Kenya is committed actually to continue the path, which is, I think, for any foreign investor, good news. Public procurement, also very important. New guidelines, new policies to increase transparency and local content requirements, also important for an investment hub and key market here in Eastern Africa. From a tax highlight, one of the tax highlights reforms probably is the minimum tax has been removed, has been scrapped, which was a relief for many medium-sized and small-sized entities. A digital economy taxation expansion on different platforms, as I mentioned, multinationals, has been widened and has been implemented to increase the tax base. Excise tax for various products, alcohol, tobacco, mobile money transactions have been increased and have been amended. Transfer pricing has been between the company transactions has been increased as well. The scrutiny and hence documentation requirements as well. So there should be definitely a focus in Kenya when you're entering the market, a focus on tax compliance, especially for companies who do intercompany transactions between Austria and Kenya, or also other jurisdictions. There should be definitely a focus on that the compliant policies accepted by KIA are in place and implemented. So see, yeah, so there are different strategies probably for market entry. Hopefully everyone can see that. Struggle a little bit, 1 second. So there's a local partnership option, then there's a direct investment, then you have the franchise and licensing, and then you have the e-commerce and digital entry, and the private partnership as well, PPP. Now, depending on your risk appetite, depending on your strategy, go-to-market strategy, the different options, as mentioned here, how you can go about it. Probably from our perspective, a good advice, actually, especially being new in the country, new in the market, having a strong, compliant, robust, and reliable relationship with a local Kenyan partner who knows the market well. So partnerships here cooperate with a Kenyan agent, distributor, reseller, or joint venture partner is probably often a very good plan, a very good way to success. I've seen cases, for example, in the healthcare sector, depending on the strategy for international, that working with strong distributors locally, consumer goods, industrial products, but also tech and tech-related and tech-enabled products and services. Then another option is, of course, establishing your own subsidiary, which could be a legal entity, a fully owned legal entity from your mother company in Austria, or a branch office. Those usually have a long-term perspective in the Kenyan market as a hub, especially in the AAC region, and this can very well fit for long-term perspective in operations, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. From the franchise and licensing perspective, you can see that with the increasing franchise footprint in Kenya and also in Eastern Africa from various international brands, providing IP, meaning the brand, and as well the knowledge and the know-how of the brand owner. And this can, for local players, for local partners who already established, but probably require some rebranding or require probably a new brand in the market to represent them. I've seen quite successful stories in the retail, education, but also in the hospitality sector, very prominent and quite relevant. And it's a very good and safe way as well to be successful in the Kenyan market with limited risks, just because this will be done with a local partner rather than with a licensor or franchise owner. Digital entry and economy, as Andreas mentioned, the Silicon Savannah. So there's a lot of platforms, a lot of new market entries platforms for various services, SaaS, digital services, niche and retail. In Kenya is definitely a very good spot to be. Very important, of course, for any market entry. Understand the legal requirements, understand the regulatory requirements, of course, and from business point of view, where do you see your niche, where you see actually your competitive advantages in the market to succeed. Public-private partnerships, we do see examples of successful corporations. I would say here, entering with government entities, I think it's very important to understand what are the terms for entering, so there's no surprise. There should be clear on the financing, clear on the cooperation term sheet, and also with expectation of your public sector partner. I think having in-depth and advanced discussions on that before entering or before considering, I think is very important to streamline expectations, to streamline actually outcomes, and to understand also a little bit the landscape here, but there's definitely as well another option, especially for significant and sizable energy, transport, infrastructure, and healthcare projects, which are very interesting in Kenya. For visa requirements, like you have, of course, the Kenya business ETA. It's a business visa. You can apply through the ETA electronic travel authorization channel with e-citizen. It's very transparent. It's very effective. Works very well. So I haven't heard significant issues on that. I think that's a very good entrant way here to probably have some exploration on business opportunities. If you want to work in the country, meaning you do business activities before actually having a proper long-term visa stay, then a special pass for 3 or 6 months is very important. The immigration authorities are quite strict and rigid on the part of, if you conduct business, if you see you in the office working, then you have to have a proper, compliant and robust immigration status or title. So please get in touch with a immigration specialist on that, so you don't face in the very beginning already some obstacles here. Long-term stay, then the classic ones you have Class T, the work permit, and Class G, investor permit. A work permit, you get sponsored by a company locally and apply through the immigration office then for your employment visa. This is usually for 2 years, but you can also have it for 1 year. And investor permit means that you have a certain a threshold, certain amount you have to demonstrate to invest in the country in order to qualify for investor visa. Profit repatriation, profits, dividends, and capital can be repatriated freely if tax obligations are met. So Kenya is definitely a very stable jurisdiction, different to our neighbors, where sometimes are a little bit, sometimes challenges, or at least you have to notify the central bank or the banks of repatriating hard currencies. In Kenya, it's relatively easy, relatively less restrictive to repatriate, and that's actually a very good point for investors also to encourage to come to Kenya. Permanent establishments have a 50% tax as of 2024, and then a tax has been reduced on corporates recently to encourage FDI. Company formation in Kenya. There are different options. Again, it depends on your appetite, depends on your market entry strategy. You have the private limited by shares, which it's probably the most common. It's like in German and in Austrian terms, the GmbH, more or less the same structure. You can have full foreign ownership, meaning you don't need a partner. Probably one caveat I have to say is when you set it up and based on the increased anti-money laundering requirements, you need to have a local director, or let's say a resident director with a care tax pin as a director, at least for the time till you have your own director, in order to establish the entity fully. Probably there's one point. Then you have branch office of a foreign entity, and then you have the LLP, the limited liability partnership, mostly for professional and service focused areas. Key steps: you have the name reservation through e-citizen portal. Then you have to submit all the documents through e-citizens for the setting up, for registering of your entity. And as I mentioned, KIA is very important, and I can't stress it enough. From the very beginning, register, be tax compliant from the very beginning. Kenya takes tax compliance very, very serious, and being on the right track from the very beginning with a good tax advisor is key here, as I mentioned. And and then licensing on sector depends as well. You need them from the Nairobi City Council as well, a business permit for your activities, for your entity, and then in general, from a basic point of view, you're good to go. As I mentioned, foreign ownership is guaranteed, so there's no restrictions on that. Only in certain fields, certain areas which are very limited, and then it's good actually to have a conversation on that and to see if those restrictions based on the business activities might apply or not. That's from my side so far. This was more or less a high-level overview. Of course, I mean, there's much more to say about opportunities and in Kenya as a hub in Eastern Africa, but I think for now that's probably a quick summary. And please get in touch with us if you have more questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gregor, for your wonderful contribution. To summarize, it's important to be well informed before you enter the market, to enter with some concrete intentions, to have goals, to have realistic goals, and to have the right partners who can help you formulate these realistic goals because they understand the target market you're entering. And finally, and most importantly, pay a lot of attention to compliance from day number one. I think this is good advice wherever we're going in the world, but definitely for Kenya as well. Talking about Kenya, let's see what our next guest speaker has to share. Peter Nguni is the founder and managing director of Frontier Insights, and that's all I want to say. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We've come a long way from our first conversation a few months ago. I'm really happy to have you here today. Really excited to hear what you have to share with our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me take control. There you go. Thank you, Gregor, for that great presentation, and Andreas for the invite. My name is Peter Nguni. I am the Managing Director of Frontier Insights. We are a market insights and strategies company. I am very privileged to work with a really strong team that helps companies in frontier markets have a better understanding of their short and long-term views. Our background is we are founding members of the Global South think tank, and we've worked in strategy, private equity, venture capital, and technology. You can find us in different parts of the world, but I'm excited today to talk about Kenya because that is where I was born and raised. I've been to many countries in the world. This is my favorite. Today we're going to talk about consumer sentiment in Kenya. We are going to take a very interesting look. We're going to look at the last 20 years and how those consumer sentiments have been ebbing and flowing within the realities of elections. We'll also look at the opportunities and risk and how to manage doing business in Kenya. As we know, these cycles happen. If you've been in Kenya over the last 2 years, as Gregor mentioned, there have been some protests, but that is not new, and it does happen. And we can see using this chart that starts in 2002 and goes to 2023. So if we bunch that as the last 20 years, coming from before 2002, Kenya was coming from a depression. So the GDP growth was very low. And we are going to have in green the GDP growth. In yellow, you'll have the different times where we've had political or protests. And then in brown, we are going to have the unemployment. But for the sake of this presentation, let's stick with the GDP and the protests. Coming from 2002, you see that there is a really steep acceleration to almost 7% GDP growth year over year. And then 2007, there was what was the post-election violence, and you see a really big dip happen then. Then if you accelerate to 2017, this is when the Kenya Supreme Court annulled the elections. So we had 2 back-to-back elections, and you can see there was a dip. And then, of course, COVID in 2020. Why are we looking at this in this kind of way? Is because Kenya definitely is cyclical in the way consumers spend money and the way the country grows from a GDP perspective. So the lens we are going to use today is looking at the different periods using gold, silver, and bronze, which makes it really easy for you to understand where we are going to end up today. So for today, let's start with our bronze policy environment. That's the period between 1991 to 2001. And what we had here is a period of really low GDP growth year over year. We also had years like 1993 where you have over 60% inflation. And what was leading to that is there was a poor policy environments, which led to difficult ease of doing business. The corruption was high, and that equaled to a very unstable currency, making it difficult to do business. Then we're going to jump to gold. Gold for us is the period between 2002 and 2007. Now, for anyone who was doing business around Kenya around this time, GDP growth was plus 6% on average, going up to 7%. Inflation was low. The environment and consumer sentiment was really good. So the consumers were willing to spend, the businesses were happy, the optimism from a business perspective, and also the government was putting forward policies that made doing business really easy. The currency was stable and corruption was being mitigated for. Then we are going to go to what we consider our silver policy environment. These are the periods between, for example, 2013 and 2023. I think this is where we are right now, where your GDP growth is hovering around 4%. Inflation is higher than what it was in the gold period. We still are being able to hold our currency stability quite well, although we see once in a while that gets shaky, but it's been quite stable. Ease of doing business is medium, but the optimism is still quite good. And if we combine those three together, how the policy frameworks correlates to the business cycles, you can see, as I mentioned, during the Bronze Age, having 92 and 93, where GDP was stagnating to near zero. Inflation in 93 jumped to 68%, which immediately caused the dollar exchange rate to jump from 32 to 58, which is almost double within one single year. This is because the legacy policies and debt issues in the country then were really squeezing the juice out of being able to do business. The thing about Kenya is you can jump really quickly from really bad to really good. And this is why we like to talk about, what are you doing to prepare for either kinds of scenarios. So from 2002, you come from 0.5 GDP growth to almost 7% within one calendar year. And this is because you had a peaceful election. Consumers were extremely optimistic. Businesses were really enjoying serving the country at that point. And you had a government that was really optimizing for a steady policy environment. Then jumping from gold to silver, around 2007, as we saw, there was a disputed election that triggered a severe crisis that caused GDP to plummet from 7 to 1.5 in a single year. So this points to how quickly things can change around these types of events. So what do we do? Generally, for us, we know that for you to be able to run a business, there are all these indicators. I'll just go back to one slide that I skipped earlier, that this slide, indicators that help us determine, how do we run our business over the next 24 months. Currency exposure equals certain implications on exchange rate stability, consumer optimism, generally does affect the economic mood. So if you have 2-3 months of protests, then that usually has an effect on businesses. Something that we are seeing more and more, and this is again cyclical, is the availability of capital, where banks starts to, stop lending as much as they lend when you have a really good environment. But what this means for us, on the other hand, if we skip back to this slide, is there are a lot of opportunities for businesses that take the time to figure out how does my business operate within these specific periods. So every business has different needs. Also, sometimes when one business is being squeezed, the other one is thriving. So depending on where you are, you have sector-specific arbitrage. And if we were to drill down a little bit on that, that means if you are, for example, a company, as Andrea said, you have a lot of companies doing maybe healthcare equipment. You can use financing as a competitive advantage if you see that your customers are not being able to finance this because they can't get the loans from the banks, but your company is able to do financing, then you can use financing as a competitive advantage compared to your competitors. On the other side, there's some companies which might not have a clear advantage. You're still doing business well, but there is a question of whether do you press the accelerator or do you hold. Then you have also an opportunity for some companies, maybe if you're in services, if you're in technology, to use this as a build versus scale. So you could use, the next 18 months to say we are going to do projects that we've been putting on hold, like maybe putting new ERP systems in place, implementation, training for employees, building our distribution systems to make them more robust so that they can be able to hold and serve the acceleration that is coming in the next couple of years. And for some of you, it might be the ability to influence policy, because right now from the government to businesses, there is a lot of dialogue happening in the policy environment. So how have we done this for us? This is something that we do for us, and having run businesses in Kenya and in East Africa for the last 20 years, this is something that we would ask you to think about. So we look at the 2 years leading to an election, and maybe let me just step back and say this is something that a lot of Kenyan businesses and a lot of business people do that maybe as a foreigner you might not know that this is happening. So you have this short-term to long-term strategy where you have, the way we package it is in a 24-month sprint where you take your first 3 months to plan, and you're planning about cash flow, security. You're planning about, what does this environment look like for my industry specifically? And once that plan is put into place, then you spend the next year executing and monitoring on that plan. Then 6 months to the elections, you get into a holding pattern where you're making sure that you know what your employees have for contingencies in case things become a little shaky. For those of you who are importing goods into the country, making sure that supplies are in 2 months to the elections, to make, if the ports are not clearing things at the speed that they usually do, making sure you have cash flows for salaries. Those are things that we usually look at in the businesses that we support. But also, more importantly, at the bottom of the slide, we also want to make sure that whatever you're doing for short-term strategy does align with what you're looking at for long-term strategy. As both Gregoire and Andreas said, Kenya is a marathon, pun intended, we're marathoners. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And the reality is, if you look at the last 50 years of the country and where we are as insights and strategy people predicting, Kenya is going to be the base and the place where you run most of your businesses in East and Central Africa. So you also need to have a very robust long-term view on how you're operating, because also you don't want to miss on the opportunities, on the demographic dividend, on the increasing spending that consumers have, and just how big the population of East and Central Africa is going to get in the next 10 to 20 years. I think that is where I am going to finish my presentation. This has been lovely. If we can help you in any way, please let us know. And back to you, Andreas.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, for your contribution. Every business has specific needs. That's the note that I took. But every business should be looking at scenarios. Which kind of business cycle are we in? Within that business cycle, what scenarios are being played out? What are the different involved parties doing? You've talked about interest rates, lending, etc. So thank you, really, Peter, for outlining your perception and for giving us basically a rundown of the last 20 years of Kenyan policy and how business happened during that same time. Now, we will hear from someone who's gone through it all, through thinking about doing business in Kenya to actually setting up a subsidiary about 1 year ago. It's my great pleasure to invite Edwin Kleiber to the stage. Edwin is the CEO of Amex Healthcare. Again, someone who's walked the walk and not just talked the talk, but now, Edwin, it's time to talk. Please let us know what it is that Amex Healthcare does and how your journey to success in Kenya has looked like. Thank you so much, Edwin.
No, thank you, and Andreas, thanks a lot. So yeah, let's see. I mean, how successful we really are, but I think we're up and running. Yeah, which is I think already good. So are you going to share the presentation, or how should we do it, Andreas?
Yeah. Sorry, it just disappeared, and if you now take control, you should be able to start it exactly.
No worries. Okay. I think I got control now. Okay.
There we go.
So what I'm gonna do in the next 10 minutes or so. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I give you a short intro what we actually do as an organization, just to understand the context, and then without much PowerPoint, I'm just gonna speak from my personal experience on spending quite some time and even more energy in Kenya on what worked, what didn't work, and as you said before, every business is different, so I highly encourage you, if you really have a question, I mean, raise it. I think there's a Q&A after, or feel free to contact me if you have some more in-detailed questions, or if you're curious, or if you make it to Kenya, of course, feel free to give me a shout. So I need to go now to my. I think I'm always sharing, and I'm ending here with Amex Healthcare. So I'm the co-owner and co-CEO of Amex Healthcare. What is Amex Healthcare? We're a company with the headquarters in Vienna, and we are one of the largest suppliers to the United Nations in healthcare. We do more than 100 million euros per year in procurement, installation, supply, and so on humanitarian aid and development projects for the UNICEF, WHOs, for the Red Cross, for the whatnot there is in terms of global NGOs. Okay. And we do already operate a hub out of Latin America, and we have a small presence in Asia. And for us, as a lot of the healthcare projects in development aid are going to Africa, it was basically our decision to set up their distribution center in Nairobi. Yeah. So what do we do is, as I said, we do this for many, many years. And basically what we do is we equip full hospitals. We ship pharmaceuticals to Gaza or to Ukraine or to any kind of areas that are suffering from natural disaster or from conflict. Yeah, and we also build infrastructure. So either first aid relief or infrastructure. Why Kenya? Because I mean, there's various reasons for going to Kenya. Then one is the surrounding countries, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and so on, are all countries where we have already shipped a lot. So there were actually a lot of different reasons. One is a logistic reason why to go Kenya. Other ones are because Kenya is actually a good place to live. Let's not forget, and you get talent there, and you have the infrastructure of airplanes and ports, and you have one vehicle that is actually a fairly new one. I'm going to elaborate on that a bit later, which is you have basically in Kenya more or less the ability to do what is done in Dubai as a free zone. So you can basically operate out of a piece of land that is technically not really Kenya, but it's a free zone, and that comes with certain benefits. Some of you might be interested in that vehicle. It's quite new, and I will elaborate a bit later on that. So that was our decision to go to Kenya. What do we do? As I said, we deliver to all kind of the major UN organizations, the major NGOs. So we are basically I dare to say, one of the very largest organizations specialized on doing the procurement on behalf of them. So we don't manufacture anything. We assemble kits. So we do a small assembling, but we're not a manufacturer. But we are compiling any kind of medical products and turn it into a turnkey hospital or a turnkey lab or something like this. Yeah. And we do this with people from more than 100 countries. And already before we entered Africa, we employ people from more than 40 countries. And we employ people here in Vienna that are from Uganda and from Zimbabwe and from Nigeria. So for us, culturally, how should I say, maybe we had a little bit of a head start. Yeah. So that's what we do. Basically, we turn facilities that are destroyed into facilities that are working. So this is actually a real picture, by the way. In this case, it was Iraq. So that's what we do. We do large-scale medical infrastructure as well. We do big mobile solutions. And what we also do is, I mean, this is a picture of ambulances we shipped in an Antonov airplane as an emergency to areas where health is needed urgently, right? So what we did was for Kenya now to say, can we basically create a hub in Kenya to supply to the region and to some extent, obviously, also to Kenya. And after lots of discussions, and also my experience was a lot of things obviously are kind of new. This is our facility. This was a picture of the opening. Actually, I think, Andreas, you're here in the middle somewhere, the second row. From our opening in Nairobi in November last year, where we basically opened a fully pharma warehouse, fully temperature controlled in a free zone facility, which means you can bring in any kind of goods. It doesn't matter if they're registered or not. You don't custom clear them. You can store them for as long as you want. You can combine that with local goods and then ship it to any other country. Or, of course, ship it to the Kenyan market if you need to do some of those. So this is what we set up, and that's where we're operating now. And so my experience of dealing with Kenya is basically comes from that time setting up this facility. And at that point in time, I mean, we can also, can I stop sharing that screen? Because actually, I think it's more useful. I don't know if that's possible. And I just talk to the audience. So maybe some things I want to give you on the way is the following. So, and also in terms of timing, because we heard very often it's a marathon. Yeah, it's a marathon, but you can run a marathon in 5 hours or in 2 hours. Okay. So I think that's maybe an interesting thought. Okay, now my video is not working. Anyhow, so
I can see you. I think the video is fine.
Okay, it's fine. Okay, thank you. So you can run a marathon in 6 hours or in 2 hours. Okay. In our case, it was like this. I think the first time I set foot in Kenya was in April 23. In January 24, I moved there with my wife and our 2 small children. They were 4 and 6 at that time, and we put them through there's a very good schooling system, so we put them into the international school there, and we had actually not much more than a laptop. And then we try to figure out how this free zone thing works. And actually it works, okay? Despite the fact that a lot of people will tell you it does not work. It does not work like in Dubai, but okay, you'll figure it out. And then we equipped this warehouse, hired a team and so on and so forth. And in November last year, we opened it. And as of January, we are fully operational. And this year, if we're lucky, we're going to break even. So to give you a contrast to that, in our warehouse, there is a standard warehouse in Schwechat, where we are with a partner, and we want to turn it into a fully fledged pharmaceutical warehouse, temperature control, and so on. 1.5 years later, we're still not done, because the bureaucracy in Austria is also not to be underestimated. So in Kenya, we built that much faster than in Austria, funny enough. What I would say is reasons why that worked out pretty well is, first of all, yes, physical presence. So my family and me, we relocated there for, let's say, the first 4 months last year. Then I flew in a couple of times, and also this year we were there for the first 4 months, more or less, of the year. So we actually really lived there. In total, probably lived there for 12 months, plus minus. So we were there. And I think you cannot just fly in out a little bit and then you want to, do the marathon quickly. And there's opportunity cost, of course, of your time doing that. But it was an amazing experience, and on a personal note, I loved it. The second thing is people. So everything stands and falls with your people in this context. So what we have seen is that in Kenya, you have an abundance of talented applications. If you put out a job ad, we get whatever, 200 to 500 applications. So which is a curse and a blessing. So for instance, we needed to use an AI that screens the CVs, because we couldn't even screen the CVs. So, and yes, if you don't do a very good filtering, you will be frustrated in the amount of interviews you have without maybe finding what you're looking for. But the positive thing is, if you find a good way to screen the CVs, you will get talent that in Europe you will have a hard time finding, because hopefully you as a foreign investor will be able to offer something to the local labor market that other people can't. And that was something I think that allowed us to build a very strong team. I think that and every organization has to figure out its own way, but it stands a little bit for everything we've seen there, which is when we go to Kenya, we need to take some of our core competences, which is normally recruitment and company culture and things like that, and then we need to adapt it to a local context and see that some stuff we do here is not working, but can we turn it into an advantage? Yeah, and I think that applied for many things. That you will see that some stuff you do back home will not work exactly that way, but maybe the fundamental basics of skills you bring, or the capabilities you bring, if you tweak in the right way, it might even become a bigger strength than you think. But you need to adapt it, yeah. And you have to be very careful, because I think something that I learned is, some people told me, no, here locally it works like this. And then local partners will do that, by the way. Yeah? It works like this. And then there is some things where you think, no, but I always do it like this. And then you have to figure out basically how you blend the truth of, yes, you need to adapt something that's done locally, but you cannot just take it and do it as other people do it. You need to basically adapt it based on your capabilities and your experience. Because then also you bring something new. If you just do whatever local people do, I don't think you're just going to have a higher cost structure. So you need to figure out, okay, what's really the thing that you do and link it. So one of the things, the examples I gave you is HR, but it's also about processes and the customer service level that we will able to provide, which is, I don't think you have the same customer service level, generally speaking, whatever business you are in Kenya that you would have in other industries. So you can make a difference here, for instance, but you need to see how you do that, yeah, and what are the tools you bring. So this is some of my insights. Okay, so if I summarize, there's a strong people component which you can turn into an advantage. The second thing is you will not be able to steer that from your office in Vienna. You need to be on the ground, at least if you want to run the marathon fast. And the last thing is try to understand what is the new thing you bring and how you need to tweak it to the local market and not just copy paste what you got, but also not making the mistake of saying, yeah, that's how locally it goes. I'm just gonna accept it and do it exactly like other people. So how do you find out this magic mix of adaptation of your core? So this is a little bit what I can share. Again, I have not smarted out Kenia. I'm only here for whatever 1 or 2 years. But if you find some bits and pieces useful of what I shared, I mean, feel free to raise questions or reach out to me. Yeah?
Thank you so much, Edwin, for your very honest and very direct insight. I really, really appreciate this. I think you've also encapsulated and covered everything that we talked about in the webinar before. You have to adapt, but you have to adapt in a way that is also sustainable and healthy for you. Yeah, it's about bridging worlds. We're bringing two very different markets together here. Obviously, there's going to be some experiences that we might not have expected, but as you said yourself, and I keep telling Kenyans this as well, Austria and Kenya are not that different when it comes to administration, when it comes to getting things permitted, when it gets to getting a business off the ground running. There's just certain stops you have to do, and you have to make sure you dot your I's and you cross your T's. As we heard also from Gregor, compliance. You have to be compliant. Thank you also, Edwin, for bringing attention to the free zones, which, as you said, are a new development and I think a wonderful opportunity that will bring lots of business to Kenya as well. Now, as we wrap up the webinar, I invite all of my guest speakers to share their camera one more time if they would like to. We have one question that I think goes particularly to Gregor Panicke. What are your experiences with the East Africa Community Visa? Maybe Gregor, you've also, Edwin, you've also traveled with it, but Gregor, what's your take on the East Africa Community Visa?
Straightforward, it works well. I haven't heard any massive issues with that. It works fine.
Sounds like good feedback. Same from my end. I haven't heard any complaints about it. Edwin, have you used the East Africa Community Visa before?
Is this recorded, what we are saying here? So
yes, but I can edit it before it goes online.
I'm not commenting on my visa standard during the last 2 years, but I think it's very relevant. I will look into this. Yeah.
Excellent. Absolutely. No, there's always a way and always a solution. It's just about having the right pieces in place. And there's oftentimes more than one solution. This is also something I think we need to keep in mind about Kenya. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, thank you also for participating. We will be sharing with you the recording of this webinar as well as the slides that our guest speakers were kind enough to prepare. Again, thank you all for joining, dear guest speakers, dear Edwin, dear Peter, dear Gregor. Thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for dialing into our webinar. This is it for today. Best regards from Nairobi. If you have any questions, you can reach us Nairobi@wko.at. Thank you so much. Best regards and see you soon. Bye-bye.